This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Lauren Enterprises, who subscribed to the show. Thank you so very much. It means the world to us. And you can support the show by going to storyworkspodcast.com. You can make a donation in any amount or subscribe for as little as $1 a month. And you can also show us your support by rating and reviewing the show wherever you listen to podcasts, or by joining us at the Storyworks Writers Facebook group. Say hey, ask questions, interact not only with us, but with each other. That is another fantastic way to let us know that you're listening and getting something out of the show. This week, we get crafty again, going deep into theme. Enjoy. Hello and welcome back to the Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Catherine Robert and I are talking about theme. Because Catherine says we haven't done a theme episode before, so... All right.
Blame it all on me. It's okay.
Oh, no. We're going to laud you with praise for bringing this to the table.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the leader's going to give us a monologue TED talk about what theme is.
I haven't prepared that TED talk, so I might do better with the Q&A format here. All right, let's start there. What's your question about theme?
Well, what would you define as a theme?
Oh, theme... So your thematic content in a novel or story, but let's talk novels here, is the emotionally driven, character-centric material. So your plot is the series of events that your character moves through toward that climax and resolution. And the thematic content is what the story is about outside of, beyond the plot. You know, if you say, what is Star Wars about? Well, it's about this guy who becomes a knight with this thing called a lightsaber, and he has to fight this big bad and save the galaxy, right? That's all plot. But what is Star Wars about? Well, it's about this boy who grew up without any parents, and you know, he finds this mentor who's a father figure, and then there's this whole like hero's journey, coming of age process, and he ends up having to battle the father who betrayed and abandoned him. That's theme. We're getting into character, relationships, emotional content. So stories are about two sets of things, plot and theme. Right? And of course they work together. You can't have them not create the whole.
Right. So which should come first? The theme.
Yeah, I was going to say, because we're used to designing or thinking. I mean, maybe the inspiration for a lot of authors, I'm not saying this is the same for everybody, would come from, you know, a twist or a thing or an event or a scene, and leads us into plotting out something to make it a fully fleshed structure. And it's often suggested that by professionals, by editors particularly, who say, you know, don't start with your theme, because if you do, you'll just lay it thick, heavy-handed through your draft, and all we'll have to do is go back and lighten it up again.
Right.
And the theme should evolve naturally from plot. Do you have any wisdom about that? You know, I mean, there's no one way, obviously.
Well, I think that theme develops organically as you write. So if you start with theme, there is the danger of being too heavy-handed and too focused on getting some kind of message across and turning it into a political diatribe instead of a story, for example, or, you know, browbeating your reader with the value of family or whatever your thematic content is. So if you start with theme, then you're facing the question, what is the story I can tell that will exemplify and illustrate this theme? And if you start with plot, then you're faced with the question, all right, I've got these characters moving through this plot. What theme is going to emerge organically as this type of person and this type of person come together and face these events, or they fight and face these events. So either process can be organic. I don't think one is better than the other. You know, browbeating your reader is bad. So you can start with theme as long as you don't go down that path. If you want to write a story, let's say that you have had a troubled relationship with your father, so you're drawn toward the theme of, you know, father-son relationships and struggles. Well, okay, what story do you want to tell that's about father-son relationships? Is the father powerful and corrupt, or is the father a huge disappointment to his son? What conflict will they get into? What plot events are going to allow that conflict to occur? If the father's a disappointment, is it because he's an alcoholic, or is it because he got fired from his job, or is it because he's a workaholic and is never there for the son? So as you look at your story elements, you're going to start seeing the threads emerge, you know, so they feed each other.
Right.
Did that answer?
Right.
Was there an answer in there?
It's one of those complex things where you might find inspirations of it in your first draft, but it could be. I know this is probably worth linking to in the show notes. I think Stephen Pressfield wrote an entire series about discovering theme, and he said it was often Sean Coyne who came to him, his editor came back to him and said, "Oh, Steve, you know, this is a book about you know, love's losses," and he said, "Oh, is it?"
Right.
Okay. So sometimes you know, you don't even recognize your own, and he wrote. And then sometimes it came about during the editing process where when it was presented back to me, go, yeah, you know, you're absolutely right. Let me go do something with that. And kind of strengthened the theme without browbeating, obviously.
Right.
So it is interesting how our unconscious probably delivers a great deal of this. You know, the conscious mind kind of strings the plot together and gets the excitement and the cliffhangers and hits the plot arcs at the right moment. But the unconscious mind is working busy in the background. They're going, this is all going to be about the dark side. You know?
Yeah, I mean, that's very true, that the unconscious mind is always working for us, and sometimes we don't recognize the own material, but we might know something like, oh, it's about, you know, a romance that goes bad. And that's a kind of a surface theme. And then the editor comes back and says, oh, it's love lost. It's this much more sort of big human theme. So, and I think we're all drawn to certain thematic elements because of our own life experiences, or the things we've struggled with, or the things that fascinate us that we really grapple with as human beings. You know?
Yeah, well, you mentioned, you know, the hero's journey. I mean, it's popularly driven so many massive stories. Star Wars, Harry Potter. I mean, it's clearly resonates with the Western audience anyway. And it's been sitting on my on my bedside table for ages and ages. But Christopher Vogler's Hero's Journey for Writers, I forget what it's called, but that's meant to be the seminal work on distilling Campbell's Hero's Journey into what you do as a writer with that. And I think that's fascinating. Maybe I've resisted reading it because I don't necessarily want to be formulaically driven for Hero's Journey as a theme. You know, so you worry about that, and that comes back to that browbeating and being heavy-handed with theme again, I guess.
Yeah, well, and, you know, the thing about theme is that you might not be aware of it as a reader as you're going through the story until that moment where the character resolves the emotional crisis. So we were talking about Kung Fu Panda in that episode on dialogue and the mentoring teaching scenes. And, you know, throughout the story, the panda doesn't have confidence in himself. He's fat, he's out of shape, he just wants food, he's not good enough, he's lazy. And we're never told those things, but you see it playing out. You see him feeling like a failure. You see the other characters shaking their head at him and going, oh, really? And at the end, when he gets the gold scroll and there's nothing on it, he suddenly gets it. Oh, the power is in me. It's about faith in myself. But that moment of realization doesn't come out of nowhere. So as a writer, maybe you get to that turning point for your character and you're like, oh, there it is. The scroll is blank. He's got to believe in himself. And then you go back and you show us all the ways in which he lacks self-confidence. So that could be one of those first draft moments. Then you're like, okay, revision time.
Yeah.
Let's weave it in.
Yeah.
So does your theme then is connected to your character arc more so than your plot arc, but it's shown through, because everything's all interconnected, right? But
right.
So your theme is much more connected to your character's arc, their flaw, their journey, rather than connected to the plot itself.
Yeah, and what kind of emotional resonance do you want your story to have with your reader? What is the reader's aha moment? The theme, and this is, I think, Robert, where you can risk being heavy-handed if you start with theme. Like, okay, this is what I want the reader to take away. This is how I want the reader to feel in this moment.
No, but I get what you're saying, though. You want that fine web where if the theme comes to you when you're either in draft or revising, you think, oh, this would be fantastic. Then the challenge is to go back and show that, not tell it.
Yes.
And that's where the finessing and the interweaving comes in. I think that's when you read a book and it's delightful and it touches more of you than just the excitement of the story itself or the resolution satisfaction of the story itself. That's when a theme's been delivered, and you may not, as the reader, even know what it is because it's sat with you. Those books that are few and far between, but they're life-changing because they stick with you. And I'm certain that must be because there's a theme that touches us, whether it's conscious or even whether it's even intended by the author. But they've written such a powerful character arc, or they've it's such a book of its times that it kind of sticks with you.
Or a book of your time.
Or a book of your time.
If you read it at just the right moment, that's because of what it's trying to communicate. And I think we were talking earlier about how authors sometimes will just because of their life experiences or whatever, that certain themes will continue to crop up. And I think that as a reader, I find authors that I cling to because of that reason as well. It's like I want to read everything they've ever written because that theme or the things that they keep writing about, not in terms of the same character or the same plot or whatever, but the same thematic cornerstone of their work resonates with me so greatly that I just want to read everything. Right. So I think that's interesting because as an author, I think sometimes you think, oh, I got to find this great theme. Well, maybe it's just something that you're working through, and that's going to resonate with other people who are working through it as well. Right.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. And thank you, both of you, for clarifying when I lost my words. But that, I think what we're all getting at here, that is the great takeaway, is that theme is something, it's a different layer of your story. It's not plot, but it is the layer that makes the story emotionally resonant with your readers, and that makes your story so memorable. It's that human piece we connect with that we keep carrying with us for days after finishing a story, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good way to boil it down. It's theme. It's something that buries itself into your head, without you necessarily knowing it.
Right. And, the way to try to put into words what your book is about is to just ask that question, what is this book about, but not plot?
Yes.
How would you define this book if you were recommending it to a friend? It wouldn't be, oh, well, first there's this dead body, and then there's this detective right. who shows up, and then they knock on a lot of doors and interview a bunch of people, and then, right? No, what's it about?
No, it's about broken people finding themselves.
Yes, exactly.
And we talked about, in our short story episode, we talked about collections based on themes. And so I think this is what kind of brought it up for me, is like, how do you, like, if you were approached, hey, we're doing a short story collection on insert theme here. Do you try to write to that theme, or do you find something that you have written to that theme to try and submit? Like, what would you?
Well, if they said, here's the theme, and I went, oh, I have this perfect story sitting in my filing cabinet, I would give them that. Otherwise, I would think about the theme, digest it, start imagining what kind of story that could turn into, and then write it, because I don't think it's ever good to shoehorn stories,
right?
Or shoehorn elements into your stories. That's when you end up with the heavy-handed browbeating kind of story. No, I swear the story is about
right.
Yeah.
And what kind of collections, like, do you know any off the top of your head that are arranged by theme that we could look at, or anything? I know I'm like put on the spot.
Yeah.
Maybe if you remember some or think of some between now and the show notes, I can put them in the show notes. But I was just thinking, because
or our listeners could come to the Facebook group, Storyworks Writers Facebook group, and recommend collections around themes. Yeah, usually when you see that, it's a kind of anthology type collection where somebody, the publisher, one of the authors, puts out a call. It's usually like a literary journal or a small press says, okay, we're putting together an anthology. Here's the theme. Everybody submit your stories. And then they select the best ones and curate the collection. Yeah. Google that.
Sounds good.
Yes. Yeah, and they're often about, the emotional piece. So if you see those calls for stories, the theme will be identity struggles, or motherhood, or, being a stranger in a strange world. So they're never a plot point. They're a human point, a character-driven point. What does it mean to be blank?
Would you say that for the most part, you should be able to boil your theme down to like that one sentence or one phrase or even one word kind of like essence?
Should is kind of a strong word. I think just like your story's premise, you can probably always get it down into a single sentence. I was just working on one of my online courses today, and I mentioned as an example of a story's premise, The Murder in Skog Hall is about a woman who buys a farmhouse and has to solve a 40-year-old murder case in order to keep her home. So the premise doesn't tell you who the character is or any of the plot events. It's distilled down. But what is The Murder in Skog Hall about? It's about a woman having to stand on her own. It's a discovery of self strength and resilience. So it's distilled down.
It tells you that's right. Doesn't it?
Right.
Yeah. And then too, there you can see the difference between premise, i.e. plot, distilled down, and theme, character arc, emotional resonance, distilled down. And those are two critical layers of the story. Nodding going on.
We're nodding.
Yes. Yeah. Other thoughts on theme or questions?
No, I mean, I think it's fascinating. It's fascinating that it's something that emerges as opposed to something necessarily that you write. I like that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly could write to a theme, and that's a fun exercise to use a theme as a writing prompt instead of a plot writing prompt. So you could all go out and write a theme, write a story based on the theme of being the new kid on the block, right? So what is that experience like? There's your writing prompt for this week. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.